Hi, scholars. It's time to do Chapter 8. And of course, in Chapter 7, when we read through their checks and balances and compromises, we had the Constitutional Convention together. They were getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and coming up with a new constitution to create a federal government that had more power but not too much power, right? So they did a lot of work. They created 3 branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, all which worked together and kept each other's powers in check. They also had to compromise on some certain things. The 2 compromises that we talked about was the Great Compromise, which was deciding that there was going to be 2 houses in Congress, 2 parts of Congress. There was the Senate, which represented every state got 2 or 1 vote, which we're going to learn in this new chapter. They got 2 senators, so they get 2 votes. And that was the Senate, and the House of Representatives was based off of population. So the more population a state had, the more people they had representing them in the House of Representatives. So that was the Great Compromise. The 2/3 compromise came down to slavery and population, because in order to determine if how much population a state had, they were trying to end the whole slavery thing, and they pointed out to the southern states, you don't consider slaves people, you say that they're property. But if they're property, they can't be a part of your population, and therefore you won't have as much representation. So what was worked out was that for every 5 enslaved people, they would count as 3 in a regular population. So it was a 3/5 compromise. So that's how they figured that out. And those were the 2 compromises we talked about. So aside from that, you would think they would have had everything covered, but no, they didn't. So they still hadn't finished their work. So that's where Chapter 8 picks up, why it's called The Convention Completes Its Work. Okay, so let's look at the big question, which we should be able to answer by the end. Big question is, what steps were put in place to ratify the Constitution? We'll talk about ratifying, what that means in a little bit. But the question remains, so in this section, with those compromises, the Great Compromise and the 3/5 compromise fractions. Okay, the convention moved steadily forward to complete its work. Several important questions remained, however. Here are some of them, along with the answers the delegates decided upon. So that was page 60. So if we flip over, page 61 has a nice little picture with the caption that says, many decisions about America's future were discussed and decided upon in Philadelphia between May and September of 1787. And some of those things were this, on page 62. What should the term of office for the members of the House of Representatives? Again, the House of Representatives, based on the population of the state, how long should those people be in office? A term means how long should they stay? Well, for representatives, it's 2 years. And that still holds true today. Every 2 years, House of Representatives, they get voted, they have to go up for re-election. Next one said, what should the terms of office be for the members of the Senate? The Senate were the ones that was 1 vote, 1 state kind of thing. And they decided that should be 6 years. That wasn't based on population, but it was just, they have a 6-year term. And that still holds true today, I think. Or maybe it's 4 years now. Maybe it got ratified. I don't know. But originally it was 6 years. How many senators should each state have? Now, in the past, according to the Articles of Confederation, it was one senator, 1 state, right? Well, they decided they should have 2. Every state will have 2 senators. And still today, every state, no matter what size, has 2 senators. The next question they discussed was, how many presidents should there be? Well, you're like, what? Yes, that's right. They considered more than 1 president at a time. For a while, the delegates considered dividing the powers of the presidents among 3 people. They feared giving all the power, again, to just 1 person. So that's what they came from England, with 1 person being in charge with the king, and they didn't want 1 person having all the power. But they finally decided that 1 president with a term of 4 years was what's going to happen. Okay? So once these outstanding questions, continuing reading, had been answered, the convention had to decide on a way for the new Constitution to be amended. So if anything came up and it needed to be changed, they had to figure out a way, how are we going to do this, okay? And you'll remember, according to this is what it says, that amending the Constitution should be harder than passing any ordinary law. So it shouldn't be just something that should be easy, because the Constitution is the frame that all the other laws are inside. So it should be harder to change than, say, a regular law. At the same time, it should not be impossible to change. And that was one of the problems of the Articles of Confederation, which required all 13 states to agree on amendments. That was difficult, getting everybody to agree and say, yes, we agree. It's still today. If you want to get a whole party of people to agree on something, it's difficult, right? What flavor ice cream is your favorite? Not everybody's going to like chocolate. All right, so we go on to reading on 62 in the middle of that second to last paragraph. The Constitutional Convention's answer was to require 2/3 of each of the House of Congress, so 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House of Representatives, and 3/4 of all of the states to approve an amendment before it could be part of the Constitution, which we still have today. So if somebody wants to make an amendment to our Constitution today, 2/3 of the House of Representatives, it has to pass the House of Representatives, and then 2/3 has to pass the Senate, and then it goes to the states, and 3/4 of all of the states in the United States have to agree on this amendment in order for it to be added to the Constitution. Now that's kind of difficult sometimes, but it's not impossible, which is exactly what they wanted. Two more questions had to be do with ratifying the Constitution. To ratify means to change or accept or approve. So if I say we want to ratify the rules of our classroom, it means that we have to approve it as a class, or I have to approve it, or the school has to approve it. Somebody has to approve it. That's what ratifying means, approve or accept. Everyone agreed that before, so on page 63, before the new Constitution could go into effect, it had to be ratified by the states. So you had all of these guys from the Constitutional Convention. They were coming up with these great ideas. They were going to put it into words in the Constitution. But before they could make it law, they wanted to put it to the states to say, hey, you need to agree to this, because the states are the ones that were, had all the people in them, right? They just didn't want to have the federal government having too much power. So that question was, how many states? And who would speak for each state? Here again, the Articles of Confederation provide an example of what not to do. The Articles had let the state legislature decide for each state and required all 13 of them to give approval. So instead of the people approving of it, the legislature, the lawmakers, they were the ones that were approving it, and then all 13 states had to do that. So the problem was the people weren't necessarily involved in approving of the amendments or the Constitution, and getting everybody in every state to do that would be impossible. It had taken 4 years for all 13 states to ratify the Articles of Confederation. Remember that? The delegation who made the Articles of Confederation, they approved that in 1777, and then it wasn't until 1781, 4 years later, that all the states were like, okay, we'll do it. All right? So, continuing on page 63, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention said, we can't let that happen again. We can't let it take forever for something to get ratified and just be sitting out there. This is also too important to let the state legislature decide, as though the Constitution were just another law. Plus, the delegates were concerned that the state legislatures might oppose ratification for fear that the new government would take power away from them. So, this is what the convention decided. Each state would call a special ratifying convention. So each state would call a group of people together. That way, the people would have direct say in deciding whether to approve the new Constitution. So the people of Arizona, well, Arizona wasn't a state back then, but anyway, so let's go to Virginia. The people of Virginia would pick certain people that they wanted, not people who were in the state legislature who had the state power, but just other people. They'd get them together and they'd say, okay, you guys are going to come together and you're going to read this Constitution and you're going to decide for us if we should approve it. And they just put everyday people in it. So again, it was the people who were making this decision, not the state governments. That way, they would have a direct say in the new Constitution, and this was a social contract theory in action. Social contract theory means you're getting the society to agree on what the contract says, which is exactly what this was. The Constitution was a contract. This is what the federal government's going to do for you, and the society at large had to approve it. And if you look at this little diagram on the bottom of page 63, you have the Constitutional Convention. So this is where all those people were together and they were coming up with the way the Constitution should be formed. And then after they get the Constitution written, it's going, the arrow points to, it goes to the state conventions. So these state conventions have to get their people together and their people have to read through the Constitution and agree to it. And then if three-fourths of the states, so at the time there was 13 states and three-fourths would be about 9. So if 9 of the states agreed to what the Constitution said, then it would be approved and therefore it would go into effect and be law. That was the ratification process. So the government had a convention, they sent what they made to the states' conventions, and the states had to ratify and vote. And if 9 of them came together, or three-fourths of the total states at the time, 9 was three-fourths, then it would be approved. So, page 64, continuing to read. The people would choose the members of these conventions as representatives of the people. These were not people who were in the legislative government of states. This was like your mom, your dad, the baker down the street, the banker, whoever they decided. They're like, hey, we like you. You're honest. You're going to go. You're going to read this, and you're going to figure it out for us. Okay. The ratifying convention's only job would be to decide whether to approve the new Constitution. So the only thing they had to do was figure out, do we like this Constitution or do we not? They didn't have to make other laws. They didn't have to add anything to it, take anything away, have discussions about whether we should change this or that. Do we like it or not? Yes or no? Very simple, right? When 9 of the states approved, the new Constitution would then go into effect. So, page 64, we're on the new section, Supreme Law of the Land. Here was another very important question for the delegates. What happens if part of the state's constitution disagrees with the constitution the convention created? So, or if a state passes a law that disagrees with it, is that okay? The delegates quickly saw that it certainly would not be okay. If that were to be allowed, each state could go its own way and ignore the new constitution altogether. You would not have a real nation at all. So they were saying, if the state's laws don't match or disagree with the federal laws, then what's the point? And they're like, whatever, our state has more power. Then there'd be no real united states, right? So the convention took care of that problem by including these words in the Constitution. This Constitution, these are the words, this Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. This made the federal government, their laws, the law of the land. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding, this means that whether a state law or a state constitution says one thing, the U.S. Constitution or Congress says another, then the U.S. Constitution or Congress, what they say goes. So if, this is not a real law, but if the state of Arizona were to say, you can only watch Fox News. Fox News is the only news station you can watch, and no one can print anything, say anything, do anything other than what is reported by Fox News, right? So Fox News is media; they're the press, right? And our state, they put that into law. Our state, Arizona, puts that into law. Just saying, as an example, and they put that into law. That disagrees with our U.S. Constitution, which says the freedom of the press has the freedom of the press and freedom of speech, right? So since that law doesn't match with the federal law, that law doesn't count. It's invalid. It's unconstitutional. So this law, the supreme law of the land, the U.S. Constitution, is the one that counts. So we wouldn't have to just watch Fox News or see it, anyway, that was just silly. So, continuing on. Should there be a Bill of Rights? That was a question as well. One important question remains. Should the new Constitution include a Bill of Rights? A Bill of Rights would list the rights of citizens that make it clear that the new national government, page 65, could not interfere with them. This list would include such rights as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and the right to trial by jury. Now, some delegates thought the new Constitution should list these. They thought there should be a Bill of Rights in this Constitution. Most, though, felt that the state constitutions already guaranteed these rights were already in the state constitution, so why would we repeat them? That just makes silly. And they also, therefore, there was not needed to repeat them. They also believed that the limits placed on the new government prevented it from violating individual rights. So remember, they created this new government that had all these checks and balances, and they thought, with all these checks and balances, the individual rights are not going to be violated, so why do we need to list them? And there was another potential problem. If they wrote the rights down, some might be left out and not protected. So they might forget a right of a citizen and be like, oh, and then the people, but it's not in the Constitution. We don't have to do that. Okay, so that's not a right. So in the end, the delegates decided not to include a Bill of Rights. And as we'll soon see in another chapter, that was a mistake. But originally, they didn't include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Next question they had to answer was how many presidents? One of the reasons the delegates finally decided to have a single one president was that they all knew who that first one would be. It was a person they knew they could trust. It was a person they knew would not abuse his power. They had trusted him to lead their armies in war. They had chosen him as chairman of the convention. You know who he was. That's right. We're talking about GW, George Washington. They knew he was going to be the first president, and they all agreed on that. So that's why they were like, you know what, we don't need 3 presidents. We'll just do one, okay? So that's why, initially, why they came down to that. So success at last, page 66. The Constitutional Convention neared the end of its work. A committee was appointed to put all the convention's agreements into language that would be right for a constitution. So they even made a special committee and said, you guys need to write this. All these things that we've agreed to, put it in there. All right? On September 12th, the delegates assembled to hear the proposed constitution read aloud. Now, here are the first words. We, the people of the United States. A committee member began. What words those were. Think about that. Not we the states, not we the people of the state of New York and Pennsylvania and Georgia. No, it said we the people of the United States of America. I didn't say America, but United States. Then the delegates heard the purpose and principles of the new national government. So basically this first paragraph, just like when you're writing an essay, the first paragraph is the introduction to what you're going to be saying. This first paragraph introduced the entire thing and what it meant and what they had proposed in one preamble is what we call it. All right? So here is the preamble to the Constitution. I want you to listen carefully. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Now, reason they put perfect union, remember, they had it says to have a better government than we had under the Articles of Confederation. So they had a government and they said, no, we need to have a more perfect union. So in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. These were the reasons they did this. So form a more perfect union, establish justice, okay, ensure domestic tranquility. Domestic means in-house, in the country. Tranquility means peace. So that means to keep peace within the country, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Okay? So that's 6 reasons purposes the why they came together to write this Constitution. And the word posterity, that means descendants or future generations. So they didn't just do this for themselves. They did this for you, for me, for your grandkids, for your great-great-grandkids, for people to come many years from now. Okay? They did all of this. They do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. As they listened, the delegates marveled at what they had achieved during those 4 months in Philadelphia. It was George Washington later who said, little short of a miracle. So it was little short of a miracle that all of this came together, that they made this Constitution. And it wasn't perfect, but it was very close to being as perfect as it could get. And there were a few more days of discussions and small changes, continuing on page 66. Then on September 17th, nearly 4 months after the Constitutional Convention opened, the final document was ready to be signed. The time for secrecy was over, so they had been in secret this whole time. Nobody had heard anything was going on in there. So they opened the windows once more. A cool breeze finally blew through this room, and 42 delegates assembled in the Independence Room. 3 of them had already decided not to support the new Constitution, meaning they weren't going to sign it. So out of the 42, only 3 were like, no, this is not what we want. Okay? But that's a big deal to get 39 people to agree on something. One of them was Edmund Randolph. And if you remember Edmund Randolph, he was the one who presented the Virginia plan to the convention. He was the one who kind of got the ball rolling. And he was one who was like, no, I don't want to sign it. Okay, whatever. The other 39, one by one, stepped to the front of the room where the document was ready to be signed. Alexander Hamilton, who had been away from the convention, returned to sign for New York. And if you ever look at the actual, a copy of the Constitution, he's signed on there, okay? So none of the 39 agreed with everything in the document. They didn't agree with all of it, but they agreed that the debates, the discussions that they'd had been conducted fairly. So everybody got to hear their side and discuss things, and it was fair. It wasn't like one person wrote the whole thing and everybody's doing what that one person says. None of them believed that it was perfect. They didn't think it was the perfect document. They knew it would need to be amended. That's why they came up with ways to amend it. However, many of them shared Ben Franklin's belief when he said he was surprised that the system they had created came as close to perfection as it did. They all believed the Constitution was a great improvement over the Articles of Confederation. As they signed the Constitution, Franklin, unable to rise from his chair, because remember he was old and he couldn't walk, spoke to the delegates one last time. At the start of the convention, said Franklin, he had noticed a carving of a sun with sunbeams at the back of the chairman's chair. So the chairman was George Washington, and at the back of his chair was a carving, because it was a wood chair, a carving of a sun that had sunbeams coming out of it. All right? He said, I have often looked at that sun without being able to tell whether it was a rising or a setting sun. So he didn't know if it was going up or down, right? But now, at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. And he was using a metaphor with this, okay? What he kind of meant was, our new country, we have just created this brand new constitution, which has created our federal government. It's near perfect. It's got checks and balances. Nobody has all the power, but they all work together in order to make a perfect union. And he was very excited because he saw that this was the birth of a brand new nation, a new country, and it was rising up out of the ground like a rising sun. And so that's what he said. But now at length I have the happiness to know it is a rising and not a setting sun, meaning our government, our country is a rising country and not one that's in decline and going to disappear. Okay? So that concludes chapter 8, and I think I helped you answer one of the questions that you'll have to answer in your assignment for chapter 8, which is, I believe, activity page 8.1. Yes. Anyway, so that concludes chapter 8, and if you have any questions, make sure you join me. Starting this week, starting on Monday, we are switching my meet time with Miss O's meet time. She's going to be doing the 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., and I'll be having my meets from 1 to 3 in the afternoon. So you can meet with me if you have questions on science or social studies, okay? So I will see you then during our meet time. Bye.